Right, okay, so welcome everybody to lesson, I think it's lesson 6 now. So last week I started to apply lots more paint to my collage techniques. Okay, so before, for the previous few weeks, we had been doing just pure collage on its own, using painted paper, inked paper, and printing those off perhaps, or making our own, and then collaging a landscape using those techniques that we'd developed. So last week what I did is I went in reverse. So I started to collage to create a texture which I then paint over the top of, and I showed you a couple of artists. I've got a few more to show you this morning as well that use the technique of making a background to then paint over the top of. So we're going to be doing more of that today, because I feel like we've done quite a lot, and I've noticed that a few people are trying to sort of keep up or catch up with the stuff that we've been doing. So we're going to continue with that this week. And then the week after, when we come back from having half term, as I call it, at school, we'll be looking more at copying from other artists to sort of learn a little bit more about what they're doing. So I've already got some artists for you to look at, and I've also put those on the website should you want to start that straight away. And on top of that, I put some more photographs for you to work from if you've run out of stuff to work from and you want some more inspiration. Okay, so we'll have a look on the old wall over here. So I've brought in a couple of artists here to show you. So we've got this one here, and the one next to it is the same artist actually. I'm going to show you a couple of others in a second. So this one's called, this artist is Michael Morgan, and he is a watercolor artist actually. So and it's quite surprising really, because it's not your normal watercolor that you'd expect, but I thought I'd show you this because of the amount of wonderful texture that the artist uses in his paintings. And he just basically just uses watercolor in a really different way. So you've got these this field over here on the right hand side, which has been scratched. It's like scratched or wiped into with the tool to create the texture. And then down here we've got this lovely detail in the foreground, which obviously leads us into the background. The interesting thing about this artist is most of his landscapes, according to him, are all made up. So he'll draw different things and details, like the house in the background, separately, and then he puts them into his own landscapes to create his own sort of landscapes and ideas. So I thought that was quite an interesting one to look at. And here's his other painting that I brought out. I've got a book on his work actually, because I thought it was interesting the way he creates his compositions and arrangements. He kind of designs the landscapes himself. And then sometimes what he'll do also is he'll use some of the modeling paste to create a texture to then paint over the top of. So we're kind of getting into the realms of using other things besides just papers to collage a texture into the background as well. So I thought I'd show you that one because it's worth having a look at him because of the way that he works in a very creative and experimental way. So let's find another artist. So the let's have a look. So this one and this one are again two separate artists. I have to bring those up to the top. Just give me a second. Bring those up to the top. There we go. Right. So this artist is an artist called Jack Pine, who I thought this would be quite interesting to look at as well, because of the way that he breaks up the picture plane. So he's obviously got these trees in here, but there's some geometric shapes appearing in the background, and this is something I thought we might look at. And we've looked at similar things before, but I thought we might look at this after half term. And this artist just here, Anita Reynolds, and you can see these artists on the website as well. and I really liked all of these different layers of textures and things that have been experimented with on here. So you can see perhaps in the center there's these lovely brush strokes coming across. That could be some of the ink collage stuff that we've used with light washes of color back over the top, for example, if you use collage, or it could be using a dry brush. So a dry brush technique is where you've got paint on the brush but there's not very much water at all, so you use the bristles of the brush to create some texture on the surface of your canvas or picture plane. I'm using a little bit of cartridge paper today, not using canvas at the moment. All right, so there's those two artists just there, and I have got some more, so I'll quickly put one of those on. So this is another one similar to Jack Pine called Judith Bergerson, and I like this composition as well because of the way the leaves have been used in the foreground. I don't know if you can see that. Just in the front there, we've got this lovely detail which is kind of blended into the rest of the picture, and then as we go back, you've got again quite geometric shapes, but you're led into the background by the highlights on the water, the reflected water in the lake at the back. That's quite a nice one to look at there. And the last one I'll bring up today is this one. So obviously we've looked at this one, but I've got a very short clip that I'd like to show you because this is pretty much what we're doing at the moment, or I'm doing, which is to layer up a surface to create texture. This is Mike Bernard again, or Bernard, and he layers up these textures on here with different cutout pieces of paper. He uses newspapers, he uses tickets, receipts from supermarkets, all sorts of things in his pictures to create texture to then work back over the top of. So a really nice artist. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to hopefully play this video, assuming it works, for you to have a look at. So let me just get this, if I can get my browser to come up. There we go. Right. It's a really short, it's only a minute long, but it's quite interesting just to see how the artist works.
Mike Bernard has been a leading artist at Marine House for 15 years. Trained at the Royal Academy schools, he's won many awards, including election to the Royal Institute of Painters in watercolours, whose patron is Her Majesty the Queen. A signature of the great artist lies in the ability to create a composition with a fresh eye on the subject. What perspective, what distance, close-up or panorama. Mike is a master of this art. His works showcase his ability to find new angles for favourite subjects. Having set the boundaries of the composition, Mike then applies his collage technique, underpinning paintings with tissue paper or old newsprint, usually related to the locale of the work. Detail is applied using paint, ink, and printed cutouts. His use of colour, sometimes vibrant, sometimes almost monochrome, is a key decision he makes as the work unfolds.
There we go. So I really like his messy desk because that's how it gets when you're obviously you're creating and things. But the thing that we were doing last week, where we put the newspaper underneath, I used tissue paper and things like that, is kind of where I'm trying to sort of get us to experiment with stuff at the moment. So we'll just have a quick look at my desk before we get started. So this is where we started with everything. We were collaging using inks and papers to actually create all the texture, all of the tone in the landscape. And last week I did this one with you, and on here you can see all the details coming through the paint. So we've got one thing that I really like, just see if I can tune it in a bit or focus it. is the maps that I often use on here. But also, if we go over here, I've painted over much of it, but there's little bits of brown paper coming through. And then just below that, there's actually some newsprint coming back through. But the overall texture of the picture that I've created is what I was also after making this piece of work. And then, you know, there's quite a lot of intense painting, and as you saw me doing last week, splattering and things. Oh, and just over here, look, we've got some of the inked papers that I created coming into the landscape as well, and it adds a little bit more interest to the picture, draws the eye to different parts and parts of the composition, and overall makes for a much, you know, a very interesting painting to do. So the way to start this is to collage underneath. First of all, use things like the tissue paper, which I've got a bit off on the floor. Tissue paper over the top, and layer up your texture and your interesting papers, as I call them, to create your picture. So this is the one that I was working on last night. So this is the original photograph. I'm still working with black and white photographs because I want to have a little bit of freedom to experiment with colour. But we'll be looking at artists next, so you'll be able to use the colours from the artists to learn more about that too. But on here, I have used all sorts of different materials again. So quite there's newspaper, there's some of my collage papers in there as well. So I'll come in a little bit closer again. There we go. So on here you can see some newspaper, and I actually applied tissue paper back over the top of it. And up here I've got all sorts of tissue paper, and on the tree itself I used some of the textured wallpaper that I've used in previous lessons. But the other thing that I mentioned earlier, which I haven't yet painted at all, is I've used some of the modelling paste that I've used previously. So I'll get that out in a few minutes so you can see how I apply it. It does take a little bit longer to dry, but it's really nice to create sort of a surface to then paint back over the top of. So to create the texture on the tree, I used my brushes to do quite a lot of stippling. So I spent quite a long time building up this area, particularly on the edges where the white area is, because I wanted that tree to really stand out like it does on here. And I've chosen a more warmer colour palette in a sense, because even though it's blue, I've got some warmer blues than perhaps this painting here, which is feels a bit cooler and things. Okay, so try, if you're trying to look at colours, choose, you know, think about whether you want your colour palette to be warmer or colder, or somewhere in between. So have a little play around with colour if you're going to try this today. But if you're still working on the other stuff that we've been doing, then that's absolutely fine. Okay, so how does everyone feel about doing all that today? Is that good?
I'm finishing the one I started last week. So.
Excellent. Good. Did you start with doing this sort of thing, or were you working on the collage?
Yes, I've put newsprint down, and bits of map, and bits of a flyer that came from Waitrose through the door.
Yeah.
And then I've put some the impasto stuff over the top.
Brilliant.
To
Brilliant.
create a texture.
Yeah. Yeah.
Where there's going to be some trees eventually.
Yeah. So, I mean, to begin with, as you saw last week, it looks kind of chaotic, you know, when you put all these different textures and things onto the surface and all the papers and things. But the idea is that you're going to put the paint over the top to actually create the actual tones and shadows and the details. So you're building that on top of the texture, and the texture just adds to the image. And obviously some of the things poking back through the image helps to bring it to life in a sense.
Yeah,
really.
I wish I'd used more map now, because the map looks really good.
Yeah, it does.
Paint over the top.
It does, and I found that it worked really well on the fields in the background of this one, actually. So I was quite pleased with that. But you know, even if you feel like you've done the collage, you're working on the paint, don't feel afraid to then put some more collage back in. Because in actual fact, when I did this part down here, I did actually add more map on even after I'd painted it. So this is obviously the beginnings of this painting. You would have just seen it halfway developed, but I just wanted to show this bit because you can then see how much of the collage and things I apply and how I apply it. So I need quite a lot of texture on the tree part, the leaves and so forth. So I've used some textured wallpaper on here, which I get from B&Q, by the way, or the DIY store down the road. And you just go in there and you get a few samples, and you've got some nice textured wallpaper that you can actually put into your paintings. And then here, look, I'm using some tissue paper, but I was just showing somebody the gouache that I use on this picture a bit later on. So I'm using tissue paper all over the sky on here. And really that's just to create a little bit of a texture, and to pick up some of those nice wrinkles and bumps when I'm painting a bit later on. And then down here I'm using some of the pre-prepared ink blended paper that I had from previous lessons. So we're really using a mixture of a load of different stuff on here. Oh, and down there, just at the moment, I'm using some modelling paste, again, to create sort of this rocky texture, which I just showed everybody just there. And then here, I wanted to get the trunk the right sort of shape. So I used a different textured wallpaper and just cut that out, stuck it on top. And then later I put some more tissue paper on over the top of that. When you're applying different things to the surface, what I always tend to do is put the glue down, or slightly watered down PVA on the surface, and then paint back over the top once I've put the collage paper down. So there's some more of my inked papers, and I've used some newspaper on the rocks just above there. And I had this nice sort of texture that I'd made by dabbing ink. So I've just sort of put a bigger sheet down on the surface, but then later, just now, I added some more tissue paper on, and then just to break that pattern up, I applied a few other bits and pieces of collage back over the top of that. And there was a little bit of map at the top, which I've now put more tissue paper over. So the nice thing about the white tissue paper is that you can see straight through, and you can see some of the techniques and things, or sorry, the different patterns and things that appear on there as well. So there goes my gouache paints. They're a lovely set, by the way. They're by Artex, and they're really useful because you can just get the paint out without having to squeeze any tubes, and you can mix it straight onto your palette as well. So I'm making up the colours in a sense. I'm using my imagination a little bit for this. So I'm not using any preconceived or real colour from the actual photo, because I basically haven't got it. Now the idea originally with this painting was to break it down into geometric shapes, a little bit like the artist we just saw on screen.
But eventually I move away from that when I get more into painting the tree, and I kind of forget about that eventually, which is okay for this experiment. But we will be doing more of these kind of geometric ideas a little way off in the future. So I'm just building in the background, and actually what it did provide a really nice, interesting background to work back over later. But I kind of realised I wanted to do something else with the picture as I progressed. So I drew this kind of oval circular shape on the sky in the background. I think really I felt it was just a bit too busy for me in the end. Especially considering I'm putting lots of texture over the surface too. So occasionally with the gouache I'm using watered down paint, and that's to get some of those lovely wrinkles appearing. So I'm going around the tree. I'm adding some splattering in there already because I do like to use my old toothbrush, not the actual toothbrush I use, but I do like to use my toothbrush to add in some splatters and things. I think it looks kind of spontaneous and a lot of fun to do that. Adds atmosphere to the picture. So I'm just mapping out the overall shape of the tree, and a bit later on I start to add deeper shadows and highlights using some greens and things. Looking at it now, I quite like the geometric idea, and I could have worked back into it to bring in some of those ideas, but I had changed my mind at that point. And I've turned it upside down so that I can work around the tree. As you can see, I'm using pure white to add highlights. Essentially what I want to do is make that tree stand out against the sky and eventually create kind of an atmospheric kind of effect in there as well. Now the interesting thing about using the computer and being online is that when I want to look at my picture from a distance, which I recommend you do as you're working, stand back from your image and just assess how it's going. The interesting thing about working with a computer is that I can look up at my screen, because I'm obviously on a webcam here, and look at my screen and see my picture from a distance as I'm progressing without having to shift anywhere. But you know, if you're working on a bigger piece, you will want to stand further back. Or I recommend you all do it, is stand further away from your picture as you work, and just looking at it from a distance helps you to see if the overall picture is looking okay. So I've added in some highlights using a pale green or a lighter sort of more yellowy green, and now I'm just going straight on in the rocks. I do like working painting rocks because I like all the angular shapes and the strong contrasts in here. So what I'm doing at the moment is I thought I probably wanted it to have kind of a yellowy sort of tinge to it, but eventually I'll work back in with some of the more obvious colours like greys and things later, and then add a few extra dark shadows to give the contrast between the lighter parts of the rocks and the darker parts. I think one of the areas that I work into the most in this piece are the leaves, because I wanted to make it look kind of, you know, like there's lots and lots of very small leaves on this tree. So I do a lot of stippling, which is very small dots. I also do splattering to make some areas seem more faded and give it that atmospheric perspective feel. You can see me working into it here, and I do a lot more on the second session in lesson 2 as well on Tuesday. So again, working back in. What I'm doing here is actually using the photograph to mask off the tree so I can just get the splatters in the sky itself. Some of the geometric shapes are still there behind the picture, which I suppose adds to the overall feel. Now on the ground here I've just added a wash of gouache that I mixed the blue and just a touch of brown into to create this tonal area to the left. And also earlier on did some more underneath the shadow of the tree. I wanted this picture to feel warmer than the last sort of cold scene that I did of the man standing up on the top of a rock in the wind. And so there we go, a little bit more of stippling and working into these finer areas. Bit of a frown on my face as I work. There we go, so working into the detail of the rocks a little bit more and then going back to my tree. It became quite, not obsessed, but really focused on that whilst I was working. So this is day 2 then of our painting project here of this Mediterranean tree on a stony beach. So I'm working, I'm working now into the rocks. So I've laid in all the basic sort of painted layers, and I'm starting to enjoy myself getting marks in with the brush and with the back of my brush. Actually, what I frequently do, and if you keep an eye on what's going on here, you can see how I turn the brush over and use the back of the brush just to scrape some marks into the wet paint that I put down. And here we go, a little bit of toothbrush white around the edge of the tree to make some areas a bit more faint than others, and that helps, on the edge where you've got all these very small leaves to make this faded area. And here I'm just correcting the shape of the tree where I think I can see shapes need correcting, and details like the highlights of the light coming through the branches and the leaves as well. Which is quite enjoyable to do. Now what I start doing is I decide to just go for it with stippling of stones and rocks. So I'm using a lot of very small round brush to do lots of small dots over the surface. And what I do after this is add much more kind of texture using, again, my faithful toothbrush. And I add some different colour into that too. There we go. So this was really enjoyable too. I do like building up this kind of textured area of colour and lines. Here I added yellow, but it came out looking green because some of the paint was still wet. But it didn't matter because I just wanted to create this like yellowy feel on the pebbles and things where the light was. And then I've added some white to add highlights around the trees. Then the tree got a bit splattery, so I went back over that and started adding some more stipply pebbles and things. An artist called Kurt Jackson does a lot of this sort of thing, splattering and stippling with the paint, working quite loosely and getting those effects of light too. Is worth looking at, Kurt Jackson. One artist that with this sort of work I've always been really inspired by. There's a lot of flair, and he often uses mixed media, so he'll put pencil in there as well, which I was thinking about doing, but I got a bit absorbed with all the painted side of things. So working more towards the foreground, and in a moment you'll see me putting some washes of colour over the rocks in the foreground. And if you remember from earlier on, I used some modelling paste down the bottom. So in a bit you'll see me putting on some washes of colour, and some of those bumpy rocky bits then start to be quite useful with the modelling paste. So one important thing to do, even though I've added some splatters, I've added some stippling, is to use some contrasting stippling and things like that too. So I've used white or very light coloured stippling on here as well, and I decided as well that it'd be nice to have some more blues in there. If you remember, I haven't chosen a colour palette as such for this, and I haven't used the photograph obviously for reference for this, but I did have an idea that I wanted it to feel a bit more Mediterranean and warm. So I've used warmer blues, and I've started to add in some of these Mediterranean type shadows in there too. There we go with some heavier, harder shadows on the rocks at the foreground. So what I did with the rocks is I painted over with a wash of gouache, and I used a tissue just to wipe away where the highlights are on the rocks, the top of the rocks in other words. As you can see, I keep flipping back between the mid-ground there and the foreground and other little areas. When you spot things, I tend to dive in and do them and forget about what I was doing before and then come back to it later. And then I thought, well, in the photo it's a bit darker at the top, so I used a wash of blue, darkish sort of blue, let the paint sort of drip down a little bit so it kind of runs into the paler areas as well. And here I go, adding some highlights on top of the rocks to give contrast between the sides of the rocks and the shadowy areas and the tops. And then I quite enjoyed adding in some more details in here too. Heavier shadows to give more contrast. I used some browns in here and some greys again, and then a bit later on I decided that I'd like just a bit more attention to be paid to the front, so I start to add in some more yellowy greens and a little bit later a bit of pink as well, because I do love pink and blue next to each other on a landscape like this. You'll see me put some pink up towards the top of the picture as well, just because I felt like it. In retrospect, it may be a bit distracting and I could change that again later. So it's all about making these decisions and experimenting a little bit too. So starting to feel a bit more pleased with the results now. There we go. There goes the pink, and then I splatter it a bit as well, just to sort of soften it a bit. But I don't know. Sometimes you know, you do things, you think, no, I'm not sure if that works, and you'll come back to it much later on, perhaps when you haven't thought about the picture for a while, and you'll think, okay, that works really well, but that bit there needs changing. So it's good to come back with what I call fresh eyes to a picture and have another look at it when you've had a break from it. In fact, some artists will put their work away for weeks and then come back to it and have another look, and they'll be able to see things more clearly. So it's nice here to see that both pictures next to each other. There are some differences, but I think overall I picked up a good feeling for the picture with some colour and some texture, of course. So this painting now feels like a stiff kind of bendy piece of paper, but looks great.